Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to the Language Fuel podcast, episode number 20. Today on the podcast, we're going to change tack a little bit, and rather than talking about a topic which is specific to language teachers, this topic, although it does apply to language teachers, can actually apply to anyone. And the topic I want to talk about is conflict. One of the reasons why I've chosen this is that in some of the social media threads that I've been following, I've seen that a lot of teachers sometimes struggle. For example, they might struggle with a policy rollout at the school that they're working in, or they might be struggling with personality conflicts between other teachers and them, or between their boss and themselves. So it's just such a universal topic, how to manage conflict, how to deal with it, how to understand it in the first place, that I thought I would dedicate today's episode to conflict management. And this is a bit of a summary of a session that I used to teach in my previous role when I was working in a corporate environment, and we ran this session with some managers, some early managers like team leaders and some senior managers, and most people find that there's a few light bulbs that go on for them. So enjoy the podcast today. I hope there is a few nuggets of wisdom that you'll find in the session, and if you'd like to download a summary, just a one-pager summarizing some of the key points from today's podcast, you can do so at the website www.languagefuel.com/episode 20. All right, so the first thing we want to look at are the causes of conflict. And the reason why it's important to look at the causes of conflict is because by understanding a person better and what their particular triggers are, or what their sort of hot buttons are, you're better able to avoid conflict in the first place, which is a wonderful way to do it, not needing to resolve it, but just by understanding that person a little bit more deeply, you can be a bit more careful with how you interact with them. Which is not to say you need to walk on eggshells, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of conflict resolution styles. It's very unhelpful for people to be walking on eggshells with each other. We still need to be ourselves, but it just helps you gain respect for people when you understand what makes them tick. So the root causes of conflict, research tells us that conflict is person-centric. In other words, what can cause conflict for one person is not necessarily going to cause conflict for another person. So you might think of the phrase like, he just really presses my buttons. The idea of button pressing is a nice image because different people have different shaped buttons, or buttons in different places, or bigger buttons, things that make them get head up under the collar a little bit more quickly than others. So some people call these things triggers or even hooks, and these are unique to each person individually. Now, research actually suggests that our triggers have to do with how we perceive ourselves. In other words, what stories we're telling about ourselves and what roles we play in those stories. And in particular, how our experiences, our day-to-day life and interactions with others fit in with those stories and those identities. Conflict happens when we perceive a threat to the identities that we have assumed for ourselves. So conflict is all about a threatening situation. Somebody is perceiving a threat, whether or not the other party in the conflict intends a threat. So that's really important if you understand conflict as threat. Now, of course, a real threat, as in a physical danger, should absolutely trigger a conflict, and our adrenaline levels need to go high, and we need to think super quick. Are we going to run from this situation, fight or flight and all of that? But obviously in our modern world, we're not dealing with tigers in the jungle and that sort of thing. So much of the conflict that we perceive has to do with a perceived threat, usually socially. So again, we might feel threatened whether or not the other person intends to convey that threat or not. So, the best way to manage a personal conflict that you might have with somebody is not to work on changing the other person or removing them from an equation, but to understand your own personal triggers or buttons and work on managing your own perceptions of your identity to sort of shrink those buttons, to avoid having those triggers being triggered, if you like. Now, some of the research around this comes from what's called face negotiation theory, and that's an old linguistic term. If you've studied linguistics, sociolinguistics, or anthropology, you've probably heard of these things before. These are some classic studies. One of the more recent researchers in the area is Dr. Stilla Ting Toomey, and she's published a taxonomy of 6 core identities, which are people's most common identity threats. Sometimes in the literature, they're called faces. Now, in her particular research, it gets a lot more complex than this, and she talks about different cultures which look, for example, at more individualistic ideas versus collective ideas. I'm not even going to go into that. I'm just going to try to keep it simple for today. So we're going to have a look at 6 main identities, which we all have, and some of these can be bigger, can be threatened more common, in other words, be a bigger trigger for us in conflicts. So the 6 things are, first of all, competence. We often feel threatened when we perceive that someone's questioning our competence, our intelligence, our skills. So if you have a peer wondering, why are you doing that? And you perceive that as them saying, that's not an intelligent thing to do, or that you don't look very competent when you're doing that activity with your class, or something like that. That can be incredibly threatening if your story that you're telling about yourself is that you are a competent teacher or you're a competent person. So that's one of the issues that we have conflict about. The second one is inclusion. We can feel threatened when we perceive that somebody else seems to be excluding us in some way, and that could be excluding us from a group, excluding us from an event, excluding us from an organizing committee, or something. And in this way, it implies that we're not a good companion. So that the inclusion is something that can be threatened. The third one is autonomy. We often feel threatened when we perceive that someone is trying to control us or impose on us or take away our self-reliance. We all want to be autonomous individuals and make our own decisions and do our own thing. So when that is taken away from us, that can be incredibly threatening. The fourth one is status. We can feel quite threatened when we perceive someone is basically dissing our tangible or intangible assets. In other words, power, that's saying, oh, you don't have much power, or you don't have a very high position, or maybe our economic worth, or maybe even our attractiveness. These are the things that we perceive as our assets. And if someone is challenging them and not giving us what we believe should be the status that goes with those things, that can be incredibly threatening as well. The fifth one is reliability. Everybody likes to think that they are reliable or dependable, and we feel threatened when we think someone is questioning our trustworthiness or our dependability. And the last one is our morality. We all like to think that we are a moral person and that we do what's right. So we feel threatened if we think someone's questioning our values or our integrity, and making an assumption that we don't follow our values or that we don't have integrity. So these 6 things, competence, inclusion, autonomy, status, reliability, and morality, they're core human issues, and they are found in cultures all around the world. It's not just, your Western culture or whichever culture you belong to. They are they are common to humans all around the world. So the trick to minimizing conflict is to develop ways from preventing your own particular triggers from setting off an avalanche of emotion. Sometimes one push of your trigger can unleash pent-up emotions from many different sources or situations, which all relate to the same identity threat. I'm thinking, for example, in a marriage, when a couple are fighting about the toothpaste. Did you put the toothpaste lid back on again? And they have a massive argument about the toothpaste. Folks, it's really not about the toothpaste. What it's about is one spouse challenging one of these identities in the other person. Maybe someone is assuming that person's not reliable because they forget to put the lids on things all the time. And when there's a big argument about it, it's not about this one particular instance. But if you have lots of unresolved or previous threats to this particular identity, it can all come rushing out at once. And I'm sure if you think about it and you think about conflicts you've had yourself or conflicts you've observed in work or in families, you've probably assumed someone was overreacting at some stage. Go, wow, why did they get such a big reaction for something so small, such an issue? And again, it's because that person has a particularly sensitive trigger in one of these areas because of perhaps previous experiences that were not dealt with. So it's important to understand that. And for the people who you work with most closely and your family members as well, it's worth talking to them about what their particular soft spots are. When I've done this exercise with my peers in the past and my peers in senior management, I shared with them that one of my particular triggers is inclusion. I like to be included. I like to be at least understanding what's going on, and I feel particularly in conflict when I feel that people haven't included me in decision making, or just letting me know what's going on. I guess in the modern world you might call that FOMO, fear of missing out. Whatever it is, that's one of my particular buttons. And so understanding your colleagues a little bit better and figuring out what for them gets triggered quite easily is good, so that you know to be careful in the way that you deal with that person. So that's the first part of it, just really understanding why people experience conflict. And again, it is very individual. But I guess the more practical side is, okay, you've got a conflict going on. Somehow there's a situation where one or more people feels conflict. How do you resolve that conflict? And I think this is a super important skill for anybody to develop, and certainly as you become a leader. And I think all classroom teachers are leaders. They're leading groups of people in a class, and there's bound to be conflict in a classroom. So all teachers would do really well to understand what I'm about to say. So one way that we talk about resolving conflict is to think about different styles of how to go about resolving a conflict. And I want to talk about 5 different styles. And how I'm going to talk about the styles is that there's a graph and there are 2 continuums, if you like, the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis talks about how much am I concerned for the other person, and the y-axis talks about how much am I concerned for myself. Now you might think, well, that's kind of one continuum. Is it about you or is it about the other person? Are you concerned about yourself or the other person in the conflict? In actual fact, you can have low concern for both self and other, or you can have high concern for both self and other. So it's a 2-dimensional graph. Now I'm going to go through the 5 different styles and tell you whereabouts on the graph they are. So the 5 different styles are dominating, integrating, compromising, avoiding, and obliging. Let's go through the graph and look at each one of these in turn and figure out when it's good to use that style and when you should avoid that style. Note that there is absolutely no right or wrong. It's never necessarily a good or a bad thing, but it can be bad to overuse one of these styles. A really good and experienced leader would understand how to change styles for which situation. So let's have a look at these in turn. First, let's talk about dominating. Now, dominating would be very high on the side of looking out for yourself, but very low in terms of looking out for the other person. So it's in the top left of that quadrant if you're imagining a graph in your head. Now, you may need to use this style when there's an emergency that requires quick and decisive action. Similarly, when there's an unpopular step that is necessary, for example, for enforcing rules or disciplining team members or cutting cost, when it's absolutely necessary, just go and do it. The company might be on the line, or the classroom might be about to hit something really negative, and you know what it's going to take to get it back on track. Just do it. It's very important. It's not a good idea to use this method of conflict resolution if the outcome actually doesn't really matter to you and there's no reason to be competitive here. Uh, and if you're not a subject matter expert, then dominating and competing for the strongest voice is actually quite inappropriate, and it's going to end up causing more conflict. Now, if you think you may be overusing the dominating mode of conflict handling, you'll know that because you end up being surrounded by yes people, people who say yes to everything you suggest all the time because they know they're never ever going to get their way and you're going to dominate every situation. That's not a very healthy way to go. You actually want peers who are going to continue to give you other ideas and different perspectives so that as a team you can come up with solutions that are better in the long run. So don't overuse this, but sometimes absolutely being the dominant party is necessary, particularly in a position of leadership where you have to have a quick resolution to something and you know exactly how to do that. On the other side of the scale, so I'm talking about the bottom right quadrant, which is high on the concern for others scale, but low for the concern for yourself. This is the obliging area. Now, it's important to use this when preserving harmony is the most important aspect of that particular conflict situation. And sometimes you just need to do that. Or if you realize that you're wrong, using the obliging style in this situation shows that you're absolutely reasonable and you understand yourself. You may want to use it when you need social credits for future use in a political situation. Or in an employment situation when you're wanting to develop your employee and that's the goal, let them experiment, let them learn from their mistakes as well. And this type of resolution style will enable that. You shouldn't use it, however, if safety and security are paramount to the situation, and it might, negate that. Now, if you are overusing this obliging method, you'll know that because discipline in the organization tends to be lax, organization meaning could include a classroom, or if you feel that your own particular ideas and concerns are not getting the right level of attention because you yourself are not pushing your agenda far enough, if you're overusing that way of resolving conflict. So those are kind of the two extremes of the scale. Let's have a look at the other three. Avoiding, as you can probably guess, is in that lower left-hand quadrant, and that's when it's low on the concern for self scale and low on the concern for others scale. Now, it is sometimes useful to use this method of conflict resolution, and it may not actually be a resolution. But look, if emotions are high and people just need to cool down to the level where they can be productive about this, it's best to probably just avoid it. Let people sleep on it, give it an hour, ask somebody to come back in a little while. If you're managing a team and you think, actually, you know what, the team itself is fully capable of solving the conflict without me, go ahead and just avoid it. Let them deal with it. You don't need to get involved. Then that's very helpful to do that. If you have really more pressing issues that you need to spend your time on, again, this may be the best way to go about it. It's not a good idea to use it when the core reason of using this avoiding method is just to avoid a frank conversation. We all need to be able to address issues, so avoiding it for comfort reasons is not a good reason for using it. You could tell that you're overusing this strategy if you're having coordination troubles. You might be waiting on people to input something, or you feel that people all around you are walking on eggshells because nobody wants to deal with anything. Everybody ends up avoiding issues that are coming up. So everybody ends up walking on eggshells, not wanting to hurt anybody's feelings because there's no sense of knowing how to resolve a conflict at all. So that's not a very healthy environment to be working in either. So again, it's useful in some situations, but certainly not a good one to use frequently. We've got two more methods of conflict resolution to talk about. The next one I want to talk about is integrating, which is the top right-hand side. So high on the concern for self and high on the concern for others. Now you can use this method when you want your objective here is to actually learn from the conflict. It takes a long time to resolve a conflict well when you want everybody to win. It's a good way to explore other people's views. And if there's really hard feelings between members of the conflict that need to be resolved to improve the organization, this is a great method to use. Integrate it. Integrate each person's perspective. And when the concerns of both parties are far too important to be compromised, this is absolutely the right way to go. However, it does take a long time and a skillful way to work through it. So if a very quick decision is imperative to keep things moving into the situation at hand, this is not a good method to use. If resources are tight or if the conflict is actually trivial and you don't need the time for this integrative method, then I wouldn't bother. Now, if you're overusing the integrative method, you might start to notice that other people are uncommitted to your own particular decisions or policies. And that's because they're used to always having their way or having their whole perspective heard every time. And again, that's not necessarily realistic all the time. So if you feel that people are not respecting a leadership decision or something like that, it's because they are expecting a different way to be handled in that conflict situation. So again, overusing is not necessarily healthy. The last method for resolving conflict, and this is right sort of smack bang in the middle, which again doesn't make it right necessarily all the time, is compromising. Now, a lot of people seem to think that compromising is the best way to resolve conflict, and I've often had that feedback. But really, in a compromise situation, nobody ends up winning. Nobody's perspective is necessarily what goes with in the end. However, sometimes it's really useful to use this method. So use it when the potential disruption involved with asserting your goals is just not worth the effort, or potentially the opposite members of the conflict are of equal power standing, so it's probably best to go ahead and compromise and not necessarily have one or the other sort of win, if you like, over the other. If there's immense time pressure and you haven't got time to explore other methods necessarily, find something that's kind of a halfway situation, or certainly a temporary solution is a good way, just compromise there. You shouldn't use a compromise method if ultimately a compromise would undermine the values and principles of the organization or your class or yourself or one of the parties. If somebody's values and principles are being compromised, really not a good way to go. You might notice that you are overusing a compromising mode of conflict if people start to be a little bit cynical and there develops a climate of gamesmanship. If people realize, well, anything I ask for, it always gets compromised, they start asking for things that are quite extreme because they know they'll probably get something that's halfway. And again, that's not necessarily a helpful or a useful or an integrity way of going about things. So again, compromising, not always the best solution, but can be a method there. So there you are, the 5 different methods for resolving a conflict: dominating, obliging, avoiding, integrating, or compromising. There is not necessarily a right answer for this, but in different situations, a different method is called for. So stay on your toes, assess the situation, what's going on, who are the different parties involved, what's the timing of this resolution needing to be, how important is it for the organization, are there health and safety issues, are there principles and values that could be disrupted here, and then make a decision as to the best way to go ahead and assist with this conflict resolution. I'm sure that's a lot of information to take in if you're not familiar with some of these ideas. So, as I said, I have made just a one-pager summarizing some of these ideas. I hope you found it helpful. In the podcast notes, there's a link to a Wikipedia article that links out to some of the research that's published in this area. And there is a ton of research. It's obviously, human nature, so the anthropological and linguistic research that's available is extremely rich. And I've just tried to narrow it down in a quick summary today. Good luck with resolving your personal conflicts. We all have conflicts all the time, and the better we're able to handle it and respect others, the more we're able to achieve our goals and manage our professional and personal lives better. Ka kite anō. I look forward to hearing some of your feedback on this. I'd love to hear, so send me an email, info@languagefuel.com. And until next time, ka kite. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.